It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, as always, from the flight deck, and of course that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, very pleased to have with us Joseph Wheelan. Who is Joseph Wheelan? He is the author of 7 books and a reporter, or was a reporter rather, an editor for the Associated Press for 24 years. He lives back in the Tobacco Road, the Triangle area in North Carolina, and an exciting work called Their Last Full Measure, The Final Days of the Civil War. Should be a good conversation indeed. Joseph, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. A lot has been written, obviously, about the Civil War. Tell us, from your perspective, it makes sense, I guess, but why, in particular, the final days of the Civil War? What held the fascination for you there?
It was one of the most turbulent periods in American history, first of all. You think of all the things that happened during those 4 months between January and the end of April. Pretty incredible. Passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the march through the Carolinas by General William Sherman, Robert E. Lee and Joseph Johnston's armies surrendered. President Lincoln was assassinated. It was just kind of mind-boggling, all the things that happened. Through all this, the North emerged victorious and optimistic and stronger than ever. The South was totally devastated.
What, again, is there a particular story or historical perspective that you believe in the research you did for this book that our opinion or our thought process might change about how the war ended?
It's interesting to look at the fact that almost all of the Confederate military leaders at the beginning of 1865 knew that the war was a loss. And they were just going through the motions. Basically, they were doing what they could. They knew it was a loss. The person that kept the South focused on still trying to win the war, even though it was impossible that they do so, was Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. And he alone was the driving force. And he never gave up. He refused to let his subordinates and military people negotiate with the Union except on a few narrow subjects. And there were actual negotiations at the beginning of February '65 on the riverboat on the James River. The South's Vice President, Alexander Stephens, was there. President Lincoln came down from Washington with William Sherman, who was the Interior Secretary. And they all knew each other from before the war. They'd been in Congress together. And they had a 4-hour discussion about how to end the war. The Southern dignitaries agreed to give up slavery. They knew slavery was done, especially when Lincoln told them they'd already passed the 13th Amendment 2 days earlier. But the sticking point was the South would not rejoin the Union, and so the war went on.
Weren't there a lot of these generals, a lot of the leaders on both sides, Lee and Grant being the classic examples, but so many of the military leaders for both sides knew of each other and may very well have not only trained together at one point prior to the war, but also even went to school together, maybe at VMI and some of those other places. That must have been an extraordinary situation.
Yes, it was. They did know each other. Many of them had fought together on the same side in the Mexican War in 1846 and 47. and now they found themselves facing each other. And they knew each other well enough, in some cases, that they knew their vulnerabilities or their predilections to use one set of tactics rather than another. So it was a real curious situation. And when the war ended, when the fighting ended, some of them became reconciled and good friends again, like General Longstreet became good friends with General Grant. And Grant, in fact, before the war, Longstreet had attended Grant's wedding, and then they fought each other through Virginia in 1864. But after the war, I think Longstreet even served as an ambassador or something in Grant's presidential administration.
What about, again, the Civil War was, again, pitting brother against brother and family against family. We've heard many of those stories. If you would share from your perspective the relationship that Grant did have with Robert E. Lee.
Grant was quite a bit younger than Lee. He knew of Lee. He had seen Lee in action during the Mexican War, where Lee was a lieutenant colonel or colonel, and Grant was a lieutenant. And he respected him greatly. At Appomattox, when Lee surrendered to Grant, Grant was very respectful of Lee. And his description of Lee at the ceremony showed that he held him in high esteem, as both as an opponent and as a person of high character. Lee knew of Grant, but he respected him as an opponent, but didn't know him that well.
Well, let's do this. Let's get down to brass tacks here, so to speak, if you would, and take us into those final days of the war. Tell us the events that led up to the actual surrender, and then get us to Appomattox.
Sure. The first event, and it is often overlooked, its importance, was the capture of Fort Fisher in North Carolina. This was on January 15th. This was the fort that kept open the last viable Confederate port, which is Wilmington, North Carolina. When the fort fell, imports no longer came into the South, and the soldiers in the Petersburg, Richmond area, who are already suffering from hunger, were even hungrier. The South suffered more. And for a lot of people in the South, when they learned of that, they knew that all was lost, that nothing could be salvaged now. And then at the end of January was the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. And Lincoln pushed this thing through. He could have waited till March, but he decided he wanted to get it done right away. In March, he would have had a majority in Congress, so would easily have passed it. But he twisted arms and pushed it through. It was another nail in the coffin for the South. February 1st, William Sherman, who had marched through Georgia in fall of 1864 and captured Savannah, began his campaign through the Carolinas, crossed the Savannah River into South Carolina in the middle of winter, and his army pushed through South Carolina. And then 3 weeks after entering South Carolina, they entered Columbia, which was the capital, and burned down half the city. It was a horrific fire. And then they pushed on into North Carolina. Lee made an overture to Grant on March 3rd to parley, maybe come to terms and end the fighting. He saw just how futile it was. But Grant had been forbidden to do that. He could only accept the surrender of Lee under his instructions. So nothing came of that. And then Sherman's army moved into North Carolina. In the middle of March, they defeated a Confederate army there at Bentonville, which was the last major battle fought in the Carolinas. April 1st was a very important date. This was when Grant launched his offensive against Petersburg. He had 124,000 men. There were supposedly, on paper, 57,000 Confederates defending Petersburg and Richmond, but there were far fewer. There were people deserting every day. Sometimes whole units were leaving. They just didn't have enough to eat. But on April 1st, Philip Sheridan's cavalry corps and a Union infantry corps crushed an 11,000-man force outside of Petersburg, led by General George Pickett, famous from Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, crushed them, and were able to flank Lee at Petersburg. Lee saw that all was lost, and he warned Jefferson Davis he was going to have to evacuate Richmond too. The next day, Grant launched an all-out attack on Petersburg. Petersburg fell. Lee's army fled to the west, went into a retreat. Troops from Richmond fled, and they met at a place called Amelia Courthouse, which is kind of equidistant between them, and then continued on west. Their plan was to find a railroad that would take them down into North Carolina, where they could unite with General Joseph Johnston's army down there. But Phil Sheridan's cavalry corps was too quick for them, and he blocked the railroads. There was no food at Amelia Courthouse. There was no food in the area. When they went out foraging, Confederates were half-starved, and they had to march day and night to just stay ahead of the pursuing Union force. And they continued on. April 6th, a place called Sailor's Creek, Sheridan's cavalry corps and Union infantry corps cut Lee's army in half. And that was almost the end of it there. But the forward half of it continued on to Appomattox then after that.
Is there a scenario, from your perspective as a writer, a historian, that you've been around this material for a while, was there a scenario that the South could have won the war? What would have to have been different?
It would have had to have been early in the war, where they would have. There were two invasions of the North early on. One of those would have had to have been successful and forced the North to the negotiating table. And the first of those was stopped at Antietam. If they had won battle at Antietam or Sharpsburg, as they called it, they could have pressed on through Maryland and endangered the North and maybe forced Lincoln to negotiate. Same thing the next year at Gettysburg. But after that, they were on the defensive, more or less. They were unable to mount a major offensive after that. So it would have had to have been early on. I think after when 1864 began, there was really no question that it was just only a matter of time.
Just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. This segment talking about the Civil War, a brand new work called Their Last Full Measure, The Final Days of the Civil War by Joseph Wheelan. He's also the author of Terrible Swift Sword, and prior, for a couple decades, worked as a reporter and editor for the Associated Press. Let's talk, now take us inside, if you can, Appomattox. Tell us about the scene or the hours leading up to that, and tell us about the dynamics that happened there.
Yeah, it was very dramatic. Lee's army was probably consisted of 15,000 men at that point that were still able to march and fight. John Gordon led one of the lead infantry corps. Behind him, James Longstreet led another one. The plan was Lee met with those two and others around the campfire night before, and they decided they would try one more time to break out of there and try to get to Lynchburg, Virginia, up in the mountains. And then at some point they would be able to unite, they thought, with Joseph Johnston's army. So they would make one last effort. In the meantime, Phil Sheridan and the Cavalry Corps had been racing along the southern flank of the Southern Army and had gotten, during the night of April 8th, 9th, had gotten in front of Lee's army and was blocking the way to Lynchburg. He set up his Cavalry Corps, which alone could not have held off Lee's army. But there were infantry corps on the way, too. They were practically running the last miles to get there by daybreak. And they did. So when April 9th dawned, this is Palm Sunday, 1865, John Gordon's corps launched their attack, and they drove back Phil Sheridan's men and broke couple positions. But then, all of a sudden, behind them, behind Sheridan's men, out of the woods, came solid lines of Union infantry, thousands of them, in ranks. And the Gordon's men were shocked, chagrined, and they stopped. And they pulled back. They could see they were not going to be able to break through. They pulled back and waited. Sheridan, meanwhile, began launching attacks on them, and he wanted to crush them. He knew this was the moment. But then there was an overture from Lee, who knew this was it. He knew he was going to have to surrender. It was like the worst thing he could imagine doing. He said he would have rather have died 1,000 deaths than do this. And he sent a messenger to Grant and said he was ready to meet and surrender. So the word filtered down to Sheridan and the troops in front of Gordon, and they ceased. And there was a ceasefire. And then, middle of the day, early afternoon, Lee and Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse in the living room of a man whose home had been damaged at Manassas in 1861, and had moved from Manassas to Appomattox to get away from the war. And so his name was Wilbur McLean. And so the war basically ended in his living room. Grant and Lee met there, and they came to terms. They shook hands. Grant recalled their common Mexican War experience. Lee did not remember it. But they came to fairly generous terms. Grant let the officers keep their sidearms and horses, and then said that the infantrymen, too, that had horses, the enlisted men, could keep their horses, too, so they could put in a crop that year. And then they went out on the porch and parted, and Lee rode his horse down among his men, and they were standing by the road weeping and crying out to him and telling him how much they loved him. It was a real touching scene. It was very sad. The Union troops wanted to celebrate, but Grant ordered them not to fire cannons or anything. And so there was no celebration on the Union side. Then a couple days later, the Confederates surrendered all their weapons and their battle flags. And that was quite a scene, too. The Union troops very much respected the Confederates. And when they came down the road, they snapped to attention. And this really caught the Confederates off guard. Their commander, John Gordon, ordered present arms by them, too. And they marched past. And one of the Union commanders later wrote, it was like the passage of the dead. It was so quiet. And they went and they piled up their weapons and flags. Very emotional scene. And it was over there, anyway, at Appomattox. There was still a surrender a few weeks later by Joseph Johnson's men outside of Durham, North Carolina, to Sherman. But that was anticlimactic after Lee's concession.
And then what about, how did the country respond? And tell us about those days, weeks, months after the war was over. What did everybody sort of call time out and sort of breathe a collective sigh of relief, or did some of the repair work and reparation begin immediately?
In the North, there was jubilation, of course. There were huge rallies in Washington. Lincoln was asked to address one, and he spoke of Reconstruction. It was his last speech, actually. In the South, there was just lamentation. There was sorrow, sadness, and pessimism. The Southerners expected the worst. Many of them were ready to reconcile themselves with the Northerners, but many were not. There was a scene at the surrender of the weapons at Appomattox where this general was approached by one of the Union officers and said he was glad it was over and he wanted to shake his hand. And the Confederate general said there is no over, basically. He said, we will never be reconciled. We hate you, sir. We hate you. And walked away. So there was strong feelings among the soldiers and among civilians, too. There was a man in North Carolina who wrote in his journal after the war, he said he gets up in the morning at 4:30 and stays up until midnight every day, hating the Yankees. Another journal writer wrote his first order of business when he has a son would be to teach him to hate the Yankees. So that feeling did not go away. It intensified in many places.
Well, we can't have a discussion about the final days, obviously, of the Civil War without at least touching on the assassination of President Lincoln. Share your perspective there and how it it does or does not bring closure to this chapter in American history.
No, it made things a lot worse, actually. But John Wilkes Booth believed that if he killed Lincoln, that Southerners would realize that the war is not lost. They would rally to the cause, and they would be able to resist longer and maybe win the war. But that was not the case at all. When people in the South heard of this, they were horrified, because they figured their belief was that the North would now avenge themselves on the South, that the peace would be horrible, and in fact, in some cases, generals who had units in Virginia had to sequester them from the towns, because they wanted to go into town and burn the towns down as retaliation. But it was a time of great sorrow in the North. It was the first assassination of a president, and it came, just 5 days after Appomattox. So he did not have long to relish, his incredible feat in carrying the country through this, the worst time of its history, really. It's very sad. His funeral procession lasted 12 days, went to all these cities in the North, and eventually ended in Springfield, Illinois. People lined up for hours to walk by his casket in whatever city it happened to be in that day. They lined the railroad tracks. They loved Lincoln. So they ended up with Andrew Johnson as president, and no one had ever thought about that, about what would happen if he became president. He was just someone that was put on the ticket so that Lincoln would get into office again in 1864. And Johnson proved problematic, as you probably know.
Well, it is a comprehensive and fascinating look at the final days of the Civil War. There are a lot of takes on this, but this is certainly a good one. The work is called "Their Last Full Measure: The Final Days of the Civil War" by historian Joseph Wheelan. How can people find out about some of the other work that you've done, and maybe grab a copy of this one as well?
I've got a website, josephwheelan.com. You can go there. You can find the book at Amazon or a lot of bookstores, actually. And this was the fourth book that I've written that touched on the Civil War. The one before that was about the Overland campaign called Bloody Spring, the 40 days, they call it, when Grant marched to Petersburg, 1864. I wrote about General Phil Sheridan, and I wrote about a prison escape in Richmond by Union officers. 109 of them escaped through a long tunnel, and that was kind of an interesting story to study.
Indeed. Well, I appreciate your time today with us. It's been a great conversation, and lots and lots of research I know that goes into the work that you do. Would love to have you on again sometime.
Okay, thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.